One of the major concerns about AI is that it's going to replace our jobs, and therefore we won't have the money that we need in order to sustain ourselves and our family, etc. There's another kind of concern that's related, though, which is that engaging in work or engaging in lots of different activities is something that confers meaningfulness in our lives. It allows us to exercise our skills, achieve levels of excellence, and that is no small part of what makes it the case that our lives are meaningful, we feel fulfilled, so on and so forth. So how worried should we be about that? My guest today, Sven Nyholm, is quite concerned. Sven is the professor of ethics of AI at IMU Munich and the principal investigator of AI ethics at the Munich Center for Machine Learning. And he thinks that while there are certainly some things that we want AI to do, some sort of low-level mundane things, there's a danger that it's going to take over too much. One thing that he talks about is what he calls the laziness trap, that there'll be things that we could do that would provide meaning, but because we get lazy, we let AI do it, and then we don't get the meaning that we should have in our lives. He also says that means we need to reach a kind of AI sweet spot. That is to say, we use AI for the things that don't confer meaning, but we don't do it for the things that do confer meaning. So we have to figure out where exactly does it make sense to use AI to replace our activities, and where is it really crucial that we engage in the activities ourselves. You'll hear me push back on a lot of the things here. One major pushback that I offer, Sven, is I'm not so sure how large the threat is. So how large is the threat? Who's threatened? That's one major area of, I don't want to say, I suppose, disagreement. We disagree, but he's more concerned than I am. Another point of, not disagreement, but at least a place where I have questions is, who's responsible if that's the case? The go-to thing is to blame AI or the AI companies for doing this, and oh my God, the AI companies robbed us of the meaning in our lives. But I also wonder, how much responsibility should we take? If we as a people choose to outsource certain kinds of activities to AI, to what extent is it our fault for being lazy? To what extent is it the culture's fault for outsourcing things to AI when we don't need to? I don't have a sort of settled view on this, but these are places where I push back on Sven, and it's what makes it, I think, an interesting conversation. Okay, so that's what this story or this episode is about. For those of you who don't know, I have a new book coming out in April called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. That's about April 21st is the official launch date. If you want more information about when it launches, where it launches, how to get it, what it's about, etc., you could go to readblackman.substack.com, and there's some information there. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast, etc., suggestions on who should be on, topics I should cover, please email me at em@readblackman.com. Okay, that's it for me. Let's go talk to Sven. Sven, here's your bold claim. AI robs us of our successes and its impact on a meaningful life. Is that your view? What does that amount to? How does it rob us of our successes in life?
Let's unpack that a little bit. I think that's a version of the claim that I want to make. So first of all, I think we have to start by just saying something about what do we mean by AI. And obviously this is a topic that people are discussing. There are different, I think one of your other guests that was on recently, Luciano Floridi, for example, has one suggestion about how to define AI. Other people have made other suggestions, etc. But I start with a very general idea, just that AI are technologies that can take over tasks from us, that we can outsource tasks to AI systems, where these are tasks that we would typically use what we regard as our intelligence to perform. So like whether it's writing texts, producing art, making recommendations, making decisions, driving cars, etc., etc. These are all things that we use our theoretical and practical intelligence to do. And now we have chatbots that can help us to write text, produce art. We have self-driving cars that can drive us around. We have recommender systems that can help us make recommendations, etc., etc. So we have technologies that have the property of being able to take over work that we would otherwise do.
Yeah.
And obviously this can be nice and convenient. It could be that the work we're talking about is boring, meaningless, pointless work that we wouldn't want to do or that we don't want to do. And so it's nice and convenient to hand it over to AI.
Sure.
But some of these things might be things that are meaningful to us. Again, go back to producing art. That's a nice example. Making music, or writing. I'm the author of a few books. I have one coming out soon. And so I wrote those myself. I didn't use generative AI. These days, however, we do have the option of, instead of doing all of the writing related work to ourselves, we can outsource more or less of it to AI. And the more you outsource, of course, the less there is for you to still be doing. And so there are at least two options. Again, going back to what I just said a moment ago, if what we give over to AI are boring, meaningless tasks, then it's not going to rob us of our successes or make our lives less meaningful. But if we hand over or outsource the tasks that we regard as meaningful, or where maybe we have an opportunity to sort of excel, to show our talents, to put in hard work, to do things that maybe no one else could do because we are the one person who has the skill, if all of that is going to be outsourced to AI, then all of a sudden we do have a problem, because maybe I don't have to put in the work anymore, I don't have to make the effort, I don't have to show my talent, and so that's the worry. Yeah.
Okay, but so let me push back, and we can get deeper into this. Because I don't immediately understand the threat, or let's say I don't understand it, maybe it doesn't seem as threatening to me as it does to you. Look, you can still do all those things, right? The fact that it can be done some other way doesn't matter. We engage in lots of activities that can be done more efficiently, but in some cases, it's engaging in the activity itself that confers the value or the meaning or the fulfillment. And so the fact that something else can do that thing, it doesn't really matter. I like to think about things like sports, for instance, or you mentioned writing. I rock climb. I want to get to the top. I engage in this activity of climbing the mountain or climbing the rock face to get to the top. Other people, other things, other animals can do it way better than I can. Mountain goats, they're remarkable at climbing rock faces. But that doesn't undo the value or the meaning of fulfillment I have. I also have a book coming out. It doesn't mean, though, and I didn't use generative AI to write it. All the sentences are written by me. But if I had written the book with generative AI, or if generative AI had written that book, okay. I mean, whatever. The point is something like, it doesn't stop me from writing the book myself. So what's the threat here?
I agree with you. You could say the same thing about chess playing computers. People are still playing chess.
Or the history of manufacturing. There's lots of things that we used to do by hand that people got replaced by various kinds of machines.
Absolutely. Well, actually, that's a good example also, because maybe now if you are someone who's very good at making furniture by hand, there might be less of a market for your skills, so to speak. Of course, in your spare time, I have friends and colleagues who do this. They make furniture in their spare time, and they post the furniture that's lovely sometimes on Facebook or other social media, whatever it is, and people admire it, etc. And that's maybe satisfying to that person, and it's nice to get the recognition that you get from your sort of group of friends and colleagues and peers or whatever online. But maybe this is not something that you can now do for a living. And more, of course, a lot of the AI companies, this is what they're telling us, they were trying to develop tools so that companies need to hire fewer people, and they can increase productivity, bring down costs, and then there will be no need to be engaging with all these humans. They want salaries, they want all sorts of benefits and insurance, etc. So this is one of the ways in which it might be a little bit of a problem, because yes, you can spend all your time writing books, creating art, making decisions, making recommendations, but maybe no one wants to pay you to do it, and so you would have to do it in your spare time. Now, of course, people might say, actually, I just think of my job as a job, and what I do in my spare time, that's where I really live my life, so to speak. Other people might say, no, if this is not something that sort of society is recognizing, where I can't make a living, where it has to be demoted to a hobby, so to speak, then suddenly writing books, making whatever medical recommendations or whatever work it is I'm doing, might seem to lose some of its value, at least its socially recognized value. So I mean, that's one way of approaching the issue. Why would this be something to be concerned about?
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of two tracks going on in this conversation, it feels like. One is about the value and meaning of something like creative, relatively idiosyncratic work by people who are, for lack of a better word, passionate about that work, or find that work intrinsically engaging, blah, blah, blah. Something like that. That's sort of one path, and you're worried about AI undermining that. And then the other side is, I think you think this, tell me if I'm getting you wrong, whatever the work is, even if you're not passionate about construction management or whatever it is, you nonetheless find meaning and fulfillment in it. So it might not be the case that you're not driven to the work in the way that ideally anyway an artist is driven to his or her work, but rather that there's something about the doing of work that is meaning making. It creates value in one's life. And that's another threat. The mundane work is nonetheless meaningful work, something like that.
Yeah, indeed. I used to be part of an interdisciplinary project with some work psychologists, and they would go out. I would do the philosophizing, me and a postdoc, and then we would have a postdoc in work psychology and a professor, and And the empirical researchers in the team, they would go out and interview people working in warehouses and things like that. And we were surprised, at least we the philosophers, about what sort of things people would find fulfilling. Yeah. And what aspects of the job that they didn't want to automate, and which aspects that they didn't want to automate. So we sometimes are operating with these sort of ideas about what people find meaningful and what they don't find meaningful that are maybe false.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, there are many ways of approaching this. I mentioned before that maybe there's going to be less of a market and less interest in hiring someone to do a certain kind of task. Yeah. Another thing that I also worry about in terms of, to just go back to the initial statement about whether AI robs us of our successes, is that there's something that I like to think of as the laziness trap. AI invites handing over tasks to AI, and then of course most tasks where people can excel are things going to be that where they're going to be doing a lot. They have to practice, they have to learn, they have to do a lot of work before you reach a level where anyone would want to recognize you as a particularly skilled writer, artist, or something like that. Yeah. And again, if you have to put in all that work in order to reach that level where it's also possible to outsource it to AI, I do worry that also fewer people will actually put in the work and learn the skills and have that level where they would actually reach. People would have a reason to admire them, to hire them, to single them out, and so to speak. Yeah, that's another part of the worry here.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not persuaded, because I think when people are intrinsically interested in something, they do stuff. Maybe there'll be some attrition due to the laziness trap. But I don't know. I think a lot of people still want to do it. The other thing is that I take it that, especially for more creative endeavors, you have people who are in some way or other infusing their personality into the thing that they make, or to put it less poetically, their personality shapes the thing that they make. And while it's true that an AI can make an X, whatever X is, whether it's a work of written art or visual art, or maybe we have AI robots that create woodworked tables or whatever, I take it that there's still going to be room for lots of different personalities to shape this thing. Right? So take the word. I'm going to take something really mundane, and maybe this isn't interesting, but I'll do it anyway, because I don't know, you got me thinking about woodworking now. There are so many different woodworkers out there. There's so many different ways to make a table. There's so many different tastes, styles, something along those lines, aesthetics. And I don't even know how many, hundreds, thousands. So I think, okay, yes, we'll have maybe fewer generic things. I don't know that AI is going to get to the point, maybe it will, but I don't see it yet, where AI gets to the point where it manifests the set of all personalities instantiated by humanity, and then creates woodwork tables in line with that personality, and then just do the same thing for the written word, visual art, blah, 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 blah. So it seems to me like you might find some people who are like, yeah, I really like this piece of art. It was AI generated, whatever. It manifests this kind of personalities, quote unquote. And other people say, I don't love the personality of this AI or that AI. I actually like the personality of Sven and the work that he did. So I'm going to buy that one. I don't know. I think just like when it comes to human tastes and aesthetic preferences and whatever, I'll stop there. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. So too with humans plus AI. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we'll have AI created stuff and human created stuff, and some will prefer one, some will prefer the other, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I should maybe mention that I'm not one of those people who are against AI in every possible way, and I don't. Sure. I agree with my colleague in philosophy, Peter Koenig, another professor in Germany, who says that there's a little bit of a negativity bias in AI ethics research. And one of the things I like to say when I introduce the topic is that there is, of course, the question of what harms and risks and problems are there related to AI, but also what are the opportunities, what are the possible benefits, and how can we make this into something good. And indeed, when we started out, I did say that, okay, if there are meaningless, boring, and so on tasks that you can outsource to AI, then go for it. Of course, as I'm saying that, I'm also reminded that a lot of the things where we do learn a skill and we learn to excel, that there's going to be some boring and seemingly meaningless aspects of it that you're going to have to go through. And I do worry that the whole idea that AI can do it for you in what I call the laziness trap, it is a real problem, because I've been seeing recently people posting on academic social media about tools that help them to create literature reviews. And so instead of going and reading some of the perhaps boring philosophical literature on a topic, you would ask AI to write a summary for you.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing that I think could actually bring down a lot of the quality of a lot of the work that a lot of people do. Because actually, when you read work and you're looking for one thing, maybe the thing that you find is another. That is the thing that you will go and run with, so to speak. And especially if you do like the work in the history of philosophy, things like that. And part of the point of reading the literature is to try to see something that other people haven't found. And so if more and more people start using these tools, and it's so convenient, you don't have to do the boring stuff. Actually, the boring stuff can actually help to make... Actually, being bored is one good way of boosting creativity in general in people. The more entertained you are, the less reason you have to create something new, to create something interesting. Then you can just consume and be passive. Whereas if you're bored, you have reason to be creative, to do something new. And so on the one hand, I do agree with this idea that we shouldn't just be out for seeing problems and risks and negativity here. There are also issues that we should worry about. And this whole topic about, is AI going to make a lot of people lose some of their capacity? Are they going to become too lazy? Are there going to be fewer people who excel at, whether it's woodworking is probably a bad example, because actually, okay, good, we can create furniture with machines, but it's going to be a different kind of thing. And that's usually not what we talk about when we talk about AI. We should talk about outsourcing sort of intellectual labor. Now, I did want to go back to one of the things you said. So let's say that you like my personality and you want something written by me rather than AI. Actually, meanwhile, there has been this development where you can fine-tune AI chatbots so that they sound like particular people.
Sure.
And actually, this can now be done to a point where it's hard to tell the difference between the actual person and a chatbot imitation of them. The famous philosopher Daniel Dennett, before he died, for example, he participated in an experiment where some researchers took all of his writings, and he wrote a lot since the 60s up until recently, and they fed that into, I think, GPT-3 or something like that, and then asked it to only produce outputs that would sound similar to those last layers of training data. And indeed, even experts on Dennett's philosophy had trouble telling new snippets of text produced by this chatbot, DigiDan, apart from new bits of text produced by Dan Dennett. You could get texts that have the sort of the personality of a particular person produced by AI, and that might be cheaper also. Like if Taylor Swift's record company doesn't want to pay her to produce new music, they might have a Taylor Swift bot that would produce the next album. So she might have reason to worry, and maybe you and I...
she owns her IP. So she sue the hell out of them. But, okay, so I hear that point. One caveat, of course, is that Daniel Dennett had written so much, so they had this stuff to train on. If Sven is up and coming and hasn't published a lot, we don't really know what his writerly voice is yet because it hasn't been created yet, so he can't rip it off yet. Oh, but okay, I do want to say that I see the point about spending time doing the boring stuff is important. There's already this discussion about how we're going to fill the jobs of the future if the sort of more junior people are replaced by AI, and the senior people are senior precisely because they went through that path of being a junior, learning a bunch of stuff, learning the nitty-gritty, doing some tedious stuff. And that's what allowed them to get better at the craft or get better at the job or have a deeper understanding of how the job works, et cetera, et cetera. How are we going to get new senior people if once these senior people die out, then the junior people didn't exist, so how are they going to be? They can't be senior. So I get that worry, and I also see the point about, especially for the kind of intellectual labor you were talking about, the research, that when you read an article, right, there's a lot of people will read articles, especially in AI, in something like Wired magazine or MIT Tech Review or something like that, and that stuff is so superficial. Usually those things, when they're good, not all the time, but often based on real research, that they've done in the lab, so to speak. And when you go and read the original research, it's so much richer. There's so much more stuff going on. There's so much more subtlety and context that's not in that, say, MIT Tech Review article. And so reading the research seems really important. I also really like your point that sometimes you're reading the thing for reason X, and then you stumble upon Y, and that opens a door for you that wouldn't have opened otherwise, it seems. And we can lose out on that. And then to your point about the laziness trap, that all seems right because you just think, I just want to know what these 7 articles think so I can write my thing. Am I missing anything based on what I've said? Yes, no. Okay, I haven't missed anything. Off we go. But perhaps if you had read each of those 7 articles, maybe in just one of them you would have found some, what's the expression? Golden nugget? Is that an expression? I don't know. You would have found something really valuable that you would use and further develop your research in a more interesting way.
Absolutely. And also, one shouldn't forget that when experts write about a topic, whatever ends up in their articles is just it's not like the whole of their expertise. The more you know about a subject, the more you have to select whatever you want to put in your research output. And then, when you read something written by an expert, you're already getting a kind of a summary, so to speak, of what they think is important about a topic. And so if you then have a summary of that, you're 2 steps removed from this rich body of expertise that's with human experts. And if you have fewer and fewer people who really develop deep expertise on different topics, and we're all just reading sort of summaries of summaries. And I'm also one of those people who don't really like to talk about AI summaries. I mean, it's strictly speaking, some people say it's better to talk about ways of shortening texts. Like when a human summarizes something, they judge what is important.
Right, they synthesize.
And they synthesize, etc. They add their maybe interpretation, whereas an AI does something different. An AI technology like a large language model. And it's not just that we're reading maybe summaries of summaries, we're reading a shortened version of a summary. Yeah, there are lots of reasons to be concerned here if people rely too much on these tools.
Yeah, okay, let me now push back again. I feel like we're getting to a point in this conversation where we're talking about a very tiny subset of the general population. Right? We're talking about people, essentially we're talking about people with PhDs doing research, something like that. And maybe even a subset of those. Maybe it's more the humanities than it is the natural sciences. And I could be wrong about that. But then again, there's lots of people with PhDs who are already lazy, who don't really do the reading, who don't really do the research. They trade on their big name. They're just good talkers. We both know that there's people in philosophy who they're pretty lazy and they don't actually know what they're talking about, but they're good at speaking. They're good at talking and persuading people that they do know what they're talking about. Anyway, that's my extra credit. But here's the upshot of all this. Yeah, there's already lazy people. Maybe it's going to enable some more laziness, but how much is it going to move the needle among those that already small subset of people? And even if it does move that needle among that small set of people, what are the, if any, effects outside of that small group of people?
No, I think that's a very valid question and a good point. Another way of approaching it is actually some ideas by a couple of philosophers who had a really interesting paper about humanities papers at university liberal arts programs. So I think Timothy Aylesworth and Clinton Castro, they have a paper about whether you should if you're a student doing a BA, should you be writing your essays using ChatGPT or some other large language tool? And they argue that actually no, you might go on to work in a completely different field. You're not going to be a professional philosopher or professional English professor, whatever it might be. But this is your one chance to engage with the big books and the great ideas of the past and present greatest thinkers. And so, are you going to waste this opportunity by reading summaries created by a mindless AI program? Or are you going to take this opportunity during your 3 or 4 whatever years of college to actually engage with these great ideas and sort of have this opportunity to think about your values and you learn about culture? So that would make things a little broader, but the class of people who go to college, or it doesn't have to be college level education, can be before that, and you're in high school, you can think about, do I want to read some of the classics of your country, whether your tradition, what it might be, or do you want to read the sort of course there was always the cliff notes and things like that before. So in a certain sense this is nothing new. What's maybe new is that people are also so extremely addicted to their phones that the first thought that a lot of people have when they have to do something or anything really is that to reach for their phone and think about, can I somehow use one of my apps, one of the tools on this little Swiss Army knife that I have in my pocket. And this just goes to this general issue that, okay, so good, not everyone is going to go on to be a researcher. And in a certain sense, you don't have to learn the skills because that's what you're going to do in your work life later on. But still, this might be this wonderful opportunity. And a lot of people look back on the time when they were students, whether in high school or in college, and think about how great it may have been to engage with these great ideas, and that's inspiring. That would make it a little bit wider, but you're right. Still, you can. Of course, we've been talking about research and thinking about ideas and things like that. There are, of course, skills in all types of professions and lines of work, etc., where you have the same thing. You can hand over the task to AI tools, or you can do them yourselves. And if you want to get good at them, you have to practice, and you have to start lower down, as you mentioned, and work your way up. Or you can just go directly from a beginner to the senior position without having to do training. Are you going to then have the relevant skill set? And
I get that point. I don't know. I think there's lots of work to be done that has to do with, this is actually a point that came up when I was talking to Luciano Florida, who you mentioned just earlier in our conversation, which is that, for instance, artists don't necessarily create the physical work of art. They might direct others, hey, here's what I want you to do, here's how I want you to create it. Architects don't physically build the building, they direct others how to build it and all that, but they're not actually physically building them, but still they're the artist responsible for the beauty of the building or whatever it is. And so, to the extent that we interact with these things, and maybe we're not getting in the nitty-gritty, but we're still directing it in various ways, we're still exercising a kind of expertise or judgment or sensitivity to nuance. So part of me thinks, are we just getting too, I don't know, something like anxious about people being able to play the role of something like creative director?
I think that's a nice example and a nice question. And again here, let's say that someone like Luciano Floridi, to take him as an example, just because you brought him up again, let's say that he uses generative AI to produce his next philosophy paper. He has so much experience with writing papers and doing great philosophy works that he's going to be able to judge what counts as good outputs from the generative AI tool, and might be able to use it in a creative and new kind of way. But if you give this tool to someone who's a beginner, and this is something I actually always tell my students, and you don't have a lot of experience yet with judging what counts as good or poor philosophy. And plus there's the laziness trap that we mentioned on the other hand. You have a lot working against you, and so in order to make sure that you learn how to judge what is good and what isn't good, art, architecture, philosophy, whatever it might be, you might still first need to train without the tool in order to be able to optimize your use of the tool. And so that's one thought I have about that. Another is that I agree with the idea that we do sometimes admire people who play this more somewhat removed role. They have a vision and then someone else has to put in the work. Sometimes though, I think we don't give enough credit to whoever has to do that work. That it's maybe mentioned fine print somewhere. If you think, for example, about you go to the art museum, you see some of these old master paintings, and then actually a lot of the canvas was painted by one of the people in the apprentices in the studio. And maybe that's mentioned that it was done in the studio of this or that great master. No names of any of those people who painted the sky or the landscape is going to be mentioned. And so they might not get the credit that they deserve to get. Of course, it's an interesting situation if you replace those human apprentices with a generative AI tool, and you make the same point. Shouldn't we then give credit to the generative AI tool? Here there might be an interesting difference though, because the person who's trying to become the next master painter, they might want to get the credit because that's a way for them to get the credentials and to say, okay, maybe I can replace the great master painter when they die or retire or whatever. Whereas the generative AI tool, it doesn't care about. Of course, you can turn it into a chatbot that will say that it cares, etc. But the point of where you might think that you should give more credit to the people building or producing the art, that's just going to be quite different in the case. It just goes away.
I actually think I'm gonna put your thesis slightly differently, and I actually think maybe there's a way in which our conversation about expertise and doing the sort of nitty-gritty stuff, doing the boring stuff in some cases in order to rise to that level of expertise, and all this talk about who's responsible for it, given that it wasn't created by so-and-so. Okay, I think that what your thesis really is something like, we need to do these kinds of things, or we need to exercise some degree of, I'm going to put it boldly right now, we need to exercise some degree of excellence, because that's what constitutes, I'm setting it really strongly, that's what constitutes human flourishing. So I think that you're not concerned primarily about unemployment. We talked a little bit about that, but that is a concern perhaps, but that's not what really, the unemployment there would be, the main problem aside from the can't buy stuff is, if we're unemployed, we can't engage in the work, whether we philosophers, let's say, think it's mundane or not. We can't engage in everyday work that is constitutive to human flourishing. If we don't do the lower level stuff, we can't reach a level of expertise that constitutes human flourishing, so on and so forth. I just want to recast your whole thing in terms of, you care a lot about human flourishing. Good, that's a good thing. And really you think that it's going to undermine the conditions under which humans can flourish.
Yeah, so the way that you originally introduced the whole idea, you also mentioned the idea of living a meaningful life.
Yep.
And indeed, I'm a bit of a pluralist when it comes to the idea of meaning in life. I don't think that, for example, flourishing or achievement is the one and only thing, the be all and end all of that. But I think that's one aspect. So if you could have a life in which you have rich and rewarding relationships where you flourish in the sense of reaching excellence in a certain art or research or carpentry, whatever it might be, if you also do good for others, so that your being in the world makes the world a better place. And there are some other ideas that I would also want to add.
There's a bunch of ingredients.
That's right. So
none of which are presented.
That's
arguably
right.
None of them are necessary, but some jointly they're sufficient.
That's right. And so that you can adding more and more AI to every aspect of your life. Is that going to make it harder to achieve these different aspects of a meaningful life, or is it going to make it easier? That's one question. Another question is, are the companies that are trying to develop these tools, is this what they're trying to optimize and maximize, so to speak?
Yeah.
Are they trying to make our lives more meaningful, richer in terms of our own achievements, our own relationships? Of course, this is maybe what they say some of the time, but when they're trying to really sell their products, they're usually talking more about boosting productivity and making it less expensive to run companies who are doing this or that. And so there might be a clash here between, and actually if you look at, as I was writing my new book, I was looking at some of the positive statements from AI companies about what's good about their tools. And then you would indeed have these kinds of things. It's productivity, it's lowering costs, speeding things up. Sam Altman from OpenAI talked about just entertainment. More AI in the world means more memes and things like that.
Great.
And Microsoft, they have what they call Microsoft for Good or something like that. They have a lab that's developed, and how can we make a societal impact? And then what they say is, okay, we're going to have better image classification, more data, better data analysis, etc. That's all sounds great, but none of it seems to be, we're going to boost those things that make life more meaningful. Whereas you might indeed worry that the sort of key ingredients of meaning in life may possibly be areas where you don't really need AI. The way to flourish in those, when it comes to good relationships or learning to excel in some domain, for those things you may not need AI. And actually AI might be a hindrance rather than help.
I'm going to say another thesis. I don't know that it's yours. I just want to hear you react to it. Suppose I said something like, okay, so Sven, here's the issue by your lights. It's that the AI companies or LLMs or whatever, AI generally, is good at speeding up time to getting to your goal, whatever the goal is, getting the thing that you want, getting the object of your desire, whatever it is. And you think that human flourishing is not mainly about getting the thing, but about doing the things. So it's more, to put it on the side of a mug, it's about the journey, not about the destination. And by robbing us of the journey and getting us to the destination too quickly, they're robbing us of the conditions under which we flourish.
No, I agree. You can put it in terms of the journey or the reaching your final destination or something like that, or you can be a little bit more dry and theoretical and use some terminology from I think it's Rob Goodman, political theorist, I hope I'm not getting his name wrong, who makes the distinction between what he calls process goods and outcome goods. And what process goods are things such as the creativity, the ingenuity, the, using a good taste, whatever you need to do along the way to producing, whether it's art, or good solutions, or if there's a problem.
Or just having a good relationship, right?
Having good relationships with colleagues, peers, etc. All of
those things are the process.
That's right. Those are things that are part of the process. And then at the end there might be a report, a book, a product, a service, or something like that. And indeed, it does seem that a lot of the AI hype is around, as you say, getting to the outcome as quickly as possible with as little effort as possible. But a lot of the things that we value, for example, among work colleagues and what we recognize, obviously we do recognize people for the outputs that they produce, but in terms of who makes, for a good colleague, with whom is it nice to go to work, who would you want to hire as to be a new colleague, we don't only care about the output they produce, that's obviously one thing that we care about, but also what is it like to be a member of a team with this person, and is it going to be... And when you look back at maybe you're having worked at a particular company or organization and you moved on, and what are the things you miss? Is it going to be the outputs that you produced, or is it going to be the process of working towards it? So that's definitely an important part of life. And if we replace a lot of the process with AI tools that does those things for us, then indeed that might just take away some of the richness of the value of certain kinds of activities. Again, I should emphasize that, of course, there are going to be aspects of work that maybe don't help you to learn your skills better, that are not particularly valuable, etc., etc. So there are going to be some things that would be nice to replace with AI. And so there's something, I like to use the expression, the AI sweet spot. Like there are AI taking over just the right amount of tasks and boring stuff, but not taking over the good stuff and not taking over so much that people don't learn the proper skills. Of course, finding that AI sweet spot is very hard. And
sure. So let me ask you a different kind of question. I don't know. I'm going to espouse a position, and you tell me if this position is not right. Okay, look, I agree with you. That all sounds right. Conditions for human flourishing are not just about achieving certain goals or ends or something along those lines, not about desire satisfaction, but it's about engaging in the process of building good relationships, being creative, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I'm on board. I'm on board with the importance of processed goods. But look, that's stuff that's going to take human effort to do. Yes, there's the laziness trap, so to speak, but it's up to humans to choose not to be lazy. And you didn't say this, but I'm going to pretend that you said it. And you seem to think that it's the fault of the Sam Altmans of the world and the other AI companies, that they're building these AIs that are going to do this stuff and increase productivity, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to just undermine human flourishing, as though humans are these completely passive things to the whims of their technology masters, when in fact, if we can't figure out how to do the hard work or do the things that are actually fulfilling, that's on us. That's on our bankrupt culture, not the presence of AI. If AI undoes the conditions for human flourishing, or if human flourishing takes a nosedive, statistically speaking, that's not the fault of AI, or not solely the fault of AI. It's the fault of a bankrupt culture that couldn't figure out how to prioritize and value things properly. Okay, so
so you might say that, okay, so let's say that I make my life meaningless by using too much AI and bowing down to these tech masters, etc. Then I might deserve to have a meaningless life, and it's my own fault, so to speak. Yeah, I do have a little bit of sympathy for that view, I must say. Although, of course, a lot of the people who are affected might be young people who are too young to really have a good idea of these things and to really be responsible, and who needs guidance, for example. And then if they're the university admin people and so on are like shoving AI down their throats, saying it's the future, then in a certain sense, maybe these young people who then are throwing away opportunities by buying into this, it's maybe not their fault, whereas maybe other people...
Yeah, I think that,
But yeah, so...
Suppose I say, though, I hear that point. I think that's a good point. It's a great point. Yes, like some people, the young ones in particular, don't know what they're choosing. They don't know. So that's why I'm trying to push something like it's the culture's fault, or it's humanity's fault, or it's our collective fault for fostering a culture of deference to technology, something like that.
It is interesting, at this particular moment in time, the amount of influence we as a society and culture indeed allow the tech world to have on our lives, the way we organize society, it's maybe getting a little bit out of hand. And I do think that you are seeing more and more, maybe not resistance is maybe too strong, but like discussion about, do we really want this? Is this really... Whether you're a Trump supporter or not, was very striking that when he was inaugurated for a second term, like there were so many tech people that were there for inauguration who took some very prominent positions in the room, and they were highlighted, just showing what important roles they have. Like it's this in the US society, but not just in the US, all over the world you have this. And a lot of people see that and they feel that actually we voted for, let's say Trump in this case, or whoever you voted for. We didn't vote for Mark Zuckerberg or whoever. Yeah. And fine, if Zuckerberg puts himself up for election and he's voted into office, then let him rule us, so to speak. But if these people are not our elected representatives, but they're then invited to take over things, then you might think that even if you are a fan of the Mark Zuckerbergs, Sam Altmans of the world, you might still want them to have that that position as part of a political process, as opposed to just they're buying their way into it. So yeah, of course, when it comes to something like democracy, that's also something where some people have a completely instrumental view of it. So if it helps us, that's fine, and we don't care how the sausage is made, whereas other people think that no, having the rights that you have in a liberal democracy, having the status as being a citizen with all sorts of basic rights, etc., that's a valuable thing in and of itself. And maybe we don't want to outsource that to AI in the tech world, so to speak. We want to have a process that helps to not just give us, but also constitutes our having these kinds of rights. And that's one kind of concern, which is, again, it's compatible with thinking that, yes, the tech world should have a lot of influence, but then we would want them to be voted into that influence and not just have them buy their way into it or lobby their way into it, maybe I should say.
And sell their way into it.
That too.
They sell the stuff and we buy it because we think, oh, this is amazing. This is so great. This is so convenient. I get to be lazy now. So anyway, that's just me saying that part of it has to be our responsibility.
Absolutely, I agree. And also, I think people are really being not just lazy in the sense that it's convenient to use these tools. They are not also a little bit lazy sometimes with respect to finding out what exactly does the tool do, how does it work, what is it good at, what isn't it good at.
Yeah.
And obviously it then falls partly on people such as myself who work in education to think about how can we help to make young people more literate. Of course, they can listen to your podcast. That's one thing they can do. And so educators of different kinds.
That's the boring stuff for them. They just want to get a summary of the transcript.
That's right. Well, then one just has to produce content about how AI works and that AI can then summarize in a nice way so that people can learn about it.
Yeah.
Because indeed,
I don't know. I actually go back and forth on this. Sometimes I think, listen, people, you're using Facebook. No one told you got to use Facebook. You don't like Facebook? You think it's a cesspool? Don't use Facebook. Get off it. On the other hand, sometimes I think, to your point, they don't know how things work. And then there's a question about, are they responsible for knowing how things work? And sometimes I think, no. So take like safety in aviation. I don't know what the regulations are. I don't know what constitutes safe aviation. I don't want to know. I don't want to do that research. I don't want to, hey, Reed, do your research on the 747. I don't want to do my research. Forget it. It's too much work. I want the government to come in and say, hey, here are the safety standards. We have experts. These are the safety standards. And you have to reach this. And so we don't expect every person who gets on a plane, every person who drives a car to understand crumple zones. That can't be, that's too high of a bar. We have government protection from predatory lending. Great. I don't want to have to learn about what constitutes predatory lending and then constantly be on the lookout whenever I talk to a credit card company or something along those lines. So part of me thinks, hey, listen, it's on you. Do the work, make the decision. Another part of me thinks it's too much. We can't handle all that information. We can't do all that research. We need a protector. So we do need government to come in and say, hey, we got this. You don't have to read all these things and learn all this stuff about, let's say, how large language models work. That's way too big of a lift for the average citizen. We got this.
Yeah, no, so I agree. And some of those examples that you mentioned, like aviation and maybe also the medical profession, those are good examples where, in addition to having the government regulate this very heavily, so to speak, for the sake of safety, you also, within those professions, have all sorts of boards that certify colleagues and work on boosting safety standards. And I think actually the tech industry, the AI industry is interestingly ambivalent with respect to this. Most of the major tech companies that work on AI, they also have people that are hired to work on what they call AI safety. And they have lots of people within the organization who argue that these tools are, again, they might provide lots of benefits, but there are also all sorts of risks. But one interesting thing is that they wobble back and forth a little bit. Sometimes they go out and say, okay, we need government to regulate us. Sometimes they go and say that, no, we understand this better than the government, so we should regulate ourselves. But also, given just the sums of money that are involved in the social influence, etc., there's something intoxicating about being in that world. And so you see a lot of AI companies, and let's not just only pick on OpenAI. Anthropic is an interesting company because they are at the same time marketing themselves as the AI safety and philosophically and otherwise informed company. However, at the same time, they also are pushing ahead with these products, and they even say at the beginning of the preamble, I think, of their AI constitution that, yes, we recognize a kind of almost like a paradox here. We are saying that these tools are risky and problematic and might lead to all sorts of problems, and yet they think of themselves as one of the leading companies, and I think they probably are.
Sure.
And so we are pushing ahead, and I call that in my book the AI wager. We're betting on AI to solve our problems. At the same time, we're gambling with at the extreme end with the future of humanity. I mean, maybe at the less extreme end with the future of excellence and some of the things that we've talked about.
Sure.
And the question is it responsible to do this? Are we proceeding like some of those people in the aviation industry with all sorts of regulations, safety measures, and redundant systems, etc., to make sure that the plane gets from A to B in a safe way, that it's going to land without a problem? Or are we pushing ahead? Actually, in space travel, there used to be an enormous safety culture. And then at some point during, I guess, the 80s or something like that, I might be getting my decade wrong, there was a more lax safety culture all of a sudden. And then indeed, space shuttle started crashing and there were all sorts of problems where the general level of sort of vigilance about safety just went down. And I worry that AI development is more like the space industry in the 80s or whatever decade it was, where yes, there are safety measures and people are working on this, but this idea of taking the next step as quickly as possible and out-compete all your competitors is just so intoxicating that even though that there's that tendency to care about safety stuff, it's just not, we're not proceeding in a kind of the manner of someone who's driving a car while buckled up, like sober, following all the traffic rules, and making sure to discharge one's duty of care towards other fellow travelers and passengers on the road. Whereas it's more like being like a drunk driver that want to quickly get home after a night out on the town. So yeah, there is a safety culture, but it seems to be a little bit loose and lax and not quite doing everything that it should be doing.
So let me ask you one last question then. So what is the thing, if you had to pick, I don't know, top thing or top three things, whatever you like, of what we should be doing better, whether it's the people or government or the AI teams, what ought they to be doing in order to not make it the case that they are undermining human flourishing, et cetera, et cetera?
I think there's a division of labor here, and we have talked about some of the different groups that have different tasks, in my opinion. We've talked about government, we've talked about researchers, students, we've talked about the tech industry, etc. And a lot of us everywhere now in society have this idea that whenever there's a problem, the solution can be summarized into AI is the solution.
Right.
We have to, in different ways, problematize and investigate this idea and ask, is that going to be right all the time, everywhere, for all problems? Or are there going to be problems where actually we don't need AI, we might need... Here's a good example. We spoke about governments and politics. There are more and more people everywhere, and the populations are bigger and bigger. And if you think of democracy as something where you want to have dialogues and people talking and deliberating together, the more people you have, the harder it is to do this. And so what's the solution? Some people say AI. Google has something called the Habermas machine that sort of is supposed to take inputs from a lot of people and create some sort of middle path between all these views.
Do they call it the Habermas machine?
They call it the Habermas machine, yes. And
amazing, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, and they have an interesting research paper about this. And actually, there was an interesting response from a philosopher who said that actually Habermas always has emphasized the idea of dialogue, direct dialogue, people actually talking, whereas the Habermas machine takes written statements by people and translates that into a sort of some sort of middle path.
But there's no rational dialogue.
No, and then people are asked to rate the output of the large language model, this Habermas machine. And so you take away that idea of having people talk with one another.
You know what the problem was? You know the problem? The people who made the Habermas machine, they just used an AI to summarize Habermas, and they got the wrong idea.
That's right. Yeah. So going back to that problem. But anyway, so the point I was going to make was that, so we all have to think about whether in our particular fields, what are the good ways of using AI? What are the parts of our disciplines or practices where we actually don't need AI? And where actually we should wait with using AI until we have learned the skill, and then we can use it in a kind of productive way. And so again, we're trying to find that AI sweet spot. That's an elusive goal maybe, but still, we do have to question this assumption that for any problem, the solution is called AI, so to speak. On the other hand, we shouldn't be total AI skeptics and say that AI is not going to help us with anything, so let's just go back to hunter-gatherer society or something like that. That seems to also be the wrong path. So it's just, let's think more about together where can we use AI in a fruitful and useful and good way, and where is it actually not useful. I've mentioned a lot of tech companies, and let me bring up one more. Google just put out a new music-making generative AI tool a couple of days ago, as we're recording this. And on the website, they say that this new version of Gemini understands musicality because it's been developed with the help of musicians that helped develop the tool. And as I read that, I just thought, okay, good. If it's true that this new AI tool is conscious and understands the conscious experience of music, which I think is probably the most important part of music, what it feels like, how you experience it. If that's all true, then yes, you might have an AI tool that understands musicality and music. But if you have what is more likely to be the case, and which I think is for sure to be the case, an AI without consciousness that cannot experience or feel music, then the aspects of musicality that it can understand, to quote them, are going to be the not important aspects of music. The most important part of music is what it sounds like, what it feels like, and how it's experienced. And that, until you have a conscious form of AI, you're not going to have. This statement that our new AI tool understands musicality, that just shows that maybe there's a bit of a wrong idea of what is important in the field of music, for example. It's patterns in data sets, maybe on some level, that is part of what music is, but on the other hand, it's
no, but that'd be like reducing our emotional relationships with other people to something like neurological explanations. Sure, that's at some level of explanation. It's true. It's just not helpful or the full picture, or the most important part of the picture.
That's right. So it behooves us to reflect on what do we value in different parts of life. Whether it's music, whether it's research, whether it's whatever it might be, medical.
All right, Sven, this has been great. We'll have to reconnect in a little while and see if human flourishing is on the decline.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Sven. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wasilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.